Welcome to the FBI National Academy Associates Officer Resiliency, Safety, and Wellness video series. In this month's episode, Dr. Kevin Gilmartin will be discussing emotional survival with Dr. David Black. Dr. Gilmartin is a behavioral sciences and management consultant specializing in the law enforcement and public safety areas. He formerly spent 20 years in law enforcement in Tucson, Arizona. During his tenure, he supervised the Behavioral Sciences Unit and Hostage Negotiations Team. He is a former recipient of the IACP Parade Magazine National Police Officer Service Award for contributions during hostage negotiations. He presently maintains a consulting relationship with law enforcement agencies nationally in the U.S. and internationally with Canada and Australia. He has held adjunct faculty positions with the University of Massachusetts Police Leadership Institute, the Law Enforcement Management Institute of Texas at Sam Houston State University, and as a guest instructor at the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia. He has been retained by several federal law enforcement agency critical incident response teams. He holds life membership status within the International Association of Chiefs of Police and is a charter member of the IACP Psychological Services Section. He holds a doctoral degree in clinical psychology from the University of Arizona. In addition to being the author of the book Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement, he is the author of numerous articles published by the Department of Justice, the IACP, the Police Service of New South Wales, and the FBI. He is a veteran of the U.S. Marine Corps and resides in Bend, Oregon, and Tucson, Arizona. Dr. David Black is the founder and CEO of Quantico, serving hundreds of public safety agencies nationally. He is a board member of the National Sheriff's Association Psychological Services Group, serves as the chair of technology and social media, is an advisory board member for the National Police Foundation's Center for Mass Violence Response Studies, serves on the IACP Police Psychological Services Ethics Committee, serves on the National Fraternal Order of Police Officer Wellness Committee, serves as the Chief Psychologist of the California Police Chiefs Association Officer Wellness Committee, and is an officer wellness subject matter expert for the California Commission on Post. Dr. Black has been serving law enforcement since 2002. We hope you enjoy this presentation.
I wanted to start off, you've been talking about emotional survival for law enforcement for a long time, but when you started talking about this was an absolutely brand new concept. I think of you in many ways as you're the grandfather of officer wellness. You're the one who got the whole thing started. What prompted you to start this? What's the origin story of emotional survival for law enforcement?
That's a polite way of saying I'm old, huh? You know, there was a number of police types back in the 1970s around the country that were looking at the emotional well-being of cops. I had no real interest in that at that stage of my life, but I did notice that a number of my friends, people who I'd gone to the police academy with, their life had changed. They no longer were the happy-go-lucky man or woman that they were previously. And I just started looking at that. Why do we start with these idealistic, committed, psychologically screened men and women? And why do we produce angry, potentially angry, disenfranchised people who start suffering tremendously in their personal life? And that was sort of the origins of this emotional survival research for me. I started finding every so often there'd be some officers that would just stand out. They were pleasant people, they were very good cops, and their life worked for them. And then there were some who were very, very good cops, but their life was an absolute shambles. And I started wondering, why did that happen? And were there any predictors that we could find? Were there things we could sort of develop a roadmap to give information to the cops so we didn't have the lost families? We could maybe address the divorce issues, the health issues. And that was sort of the origins of the emotional survival. We were doing it through training for 20, 25 years. And somebody said, you should write a book. And I said, I have no interest in writing a book. And he was pretty persistent. He was the sergeant at the department I worked at. And he goes, you know, if you don't write a book, this is going to die when you die. I said, well, you're a pretty positive guy. He says, you don't think cemeteries are full of good ideas that people didn't write down? So I just started writing this down. We wrote the book, Emotional Survival, and we've been really shocked by how it's had legs and how officers seem to appreciate the roadmap of maybe if there's a few things they do differently in their personal life, maybe we can help them have a more successful, not just police career, but personal life and physical health. So that was sort of the origins to the Emotional Survival and the book and the seminars.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you so much. It's a fascinating origin story, and the book and your teachings have had such a big influence that you know there's so many police departments and academies make your book required reading. It's part of field training programs. It's mandatory reading for sergeant exams, etc. All different agencies and countries around the world, and it's even had an impact far beyond just officers. Of course, it's impacted spouses, and I know your intention was to support law enforcement families for the start, but it's also had a big impact on the fire service, dispatchers, corrections, every sort of public safety profession.
Well, you know, our goal was to try and help the people who help others, and trying to look at, is there any common denominator to people who are first responders? What are the attributes? You know, with the old adage of some people, you know, run away from the fire and some people run towards it. And is there some psychological or physiological common denominator that impacts people? And if there is, can we better train our police officers to do that job professionally, but also not have to pay the price personally that so many of our first responders do? So many lost families and health issues that we could avoid. And we started looking at that. And as the research and the interactions continued, we started stumbling across people who were working in parallel areas. In Reno, we found a group that was working on premature death in first responders. Why are we having firefighters and police officers develop and die of, unfortunately, heart disease in their 30s and early 40s? Why, when these were men and women who were very physically healthy just 10, 15 years previously? And we started trying to tie the psychological and physiological issues together.
Well, and so officer safety and hypervigilance are two issues you've written about and spoken about so extensively. Be very interested in hearing your thoughts on those today.
Well, you know, we spend a lot of time right now talking about all the things that police officers have to see. There's a very necessary and long overdue appreciation of post-traumatic stress and post-traumatic stress disorder in trying to help cops deal with what they have to see on the job. But my interests are not just what cops have to see, but how cops have to look at things. I think when you ask people in law enforcement, do cops see the world the way normal people see the world? And they'll say no, and they shouldn't. You know, if a cop thought normally and looked at the world normally, a cop would walk up on a car and they wouldn't see the gun, but the gun would see them. So we have to teach men and women in law enforcement, how do you go into harm's way and survive it tactically? That's the first object. We have to teach cops how to be safe. And we do this, and we've had great success in the law enforcement field in 30 years. Up until recently, we've had declining felony death rates because cops know how to do their job. But when we teach officers safety, we're teaching cops a very unique way of viewing the world psychologically. Most people don't have to think the way cops have to think. Most people have the luxury of staying, for the most part, with normal thinking. We know this. If you live in a world that's safe, that's predictable, and it's rational, most of the time life will work pretty well for you. And it's easy to maintain mental health in those environments. If it's safe, if it's rational, if it's predictable, and if things happen for a reason, then you're in kind of a place in the world where life will work well for you. That's the first thing a cop learns, is that life is not fair. Life is not rational. There are things that happen for no justifiable reason. And that's what cops do. They go into those environments Nobody dials 911 because normal behavior is taking place. They're dialing 911 because some event is taking place outside what can normally be handled. So we train these men and women in law enforcement to go into these situations. We teach them officer safety. If you think what officer safety is, it's a unique way of viewing the world. Cops are problem solvers. They have to walk into unknown events every day. Well, I always picture an unknown event as just a question mark. And the cop approaches this question mark, the dispatcher approaches this question mark, and normal thinking doesn't work for them. Normal people, and I'm not trying to use that word normal in a judgmental sense. I mean, the majority of people can look at a problem and solve it by what I call probability thinking. I have to go to the airport later. It's probably going to take me 20 minutes to drive to the airport. The weather says it's going to rain today, so I should probably take a raincoat. Normal people can solve problems by probability thinking, which is a pretty positive way of thinking. The question mark goes to the positive side. They do probability thinking. Cops can't think that way. That would be a disaster if a cop used normal thinking. If they did, they'd say things like, well, I'm probably not going to get shot tonight, so I don't need to wear ballistic body armor. I'm probably not going to be in an officer-involved shooting, so I don't need to carry a weapon. Cops early learn, and they're trained, and they practice not probability thinking, but possibility thinking. A cop has to learn to walk into a situation and view that entire situation from every worst case scenario that's possible. It dictates how close they stand to people. It dictates how they approach a vehicle, where they would stand for tactical advantage. It dictates seeing every potential consequence in that situation. And we teach this to the men and women in law enforcement, which we have to. It saves lives. The most important decision a cop makes every day is to come home safely. That's first and foremost. Officer safety has to be mastered. But when you teach possibility thinking, the officer sees the world through this filter of distrust. See, trust, which is necessary for mental health, trust is no friend of a police officer on duty. Distrust keeps a cop alive. Trust doesn't keep a cop alive. Cop walks up, knocks on a door. They shouldn't sit there and trust that a round's not going to come through the door. They step to the left or the right, doing possibility thinking, thinking the worst case scenario. That's very easy to teach that to a cop. When we teach street survival, we can't teach it as if it has no consequence, because there is an emotional consequence to that, because the cop starts seeing the world through that perspective. It'd be very simple if they just get off duty and then switch back to normal thinking. But there's a biological component that takes place, and that's where hypervigilance comes in. The first aspect is we change how cops see the world, but then the second is the policing experience has a biological component. When a cop is on duty, when a dispatcher's on duty, they don't know what's going to take place. So in order to stay alive, they have this elevated level of alertness. They scan the environment, they see what's taking place, and this is hypervigilance. The best example or best explanation of hypervigilance I can think of was with the recent shooting, the tragic ambush of the two deputy sheriffs in Los Angeles and Compton. Sheriff Villanueva afterwards said he wanted his deputies to have their head on a swivel. That's hypervigilance. The officer scanning the environment, being cognizant of potential risk. Now, doing that engages the biology of alertness. What happens is the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system innervates. The officers are alert, they're quick thinking, they're alive, they're perceptive, they have very good analytical skills, and they solve problems. But the problem really is that that's a biological state. And the officer remains in that elevated biological state of hypervigilance for the entire duration of their shift. Then they get off duty, and the body homeostatically shifts from the sympathetic branch to the parasympathetic branch. So the officer on duty who's solving problems, resolving issues, thinking quickly on their feet, now this man or woman is off duty, and the biological pendulum swings into the opposite direction. Now this person wants to withdraw, is disengaged, and they interpret this fatigued feeling as being tired. Tiredness is a physical state. You want to get tired, get on the bad end of a shovel, dig a ditch, When you're done, you'll be fatigued. The appropriate response would be to sit down, to disengage, and recuperate. What our first responders drop into is this after effect of protracted alertness, which drops them into the parasympathetic state. Unfortunately, that's where they stop talking. They pull back socially. They withdraw. So, part of the problem is what cops see and do on duty, but the real problem in my experience is what they don't do off duty. We see this withdrawal from social relationships. We see the lack of communication with their life partners. We see physical disengagement. And over the long term, the resiliency drops off tremendously. So the irony of this, or the paradox of this, is the very event that keeps cops alive in the short run ends up destroying their life emotionally in the long run. So I picture this as a roller coaster. Most people live in the normal range. Our cops have to go above that when they're on duty, but we have to teach them how to get out of the bottom of that roller coaster when they're off duty, or their families suffer, their health suffers, socially they suffer. And so that's when we talk about hypervigilance and how to master it, that's what we're speaking about.
So there are there's these issues of officer safety, there's hypervigilance, and then you're now talking about the hypervigilance biological roller coaster. And that's such a central theme in your book and your training, such an important concept. I wonder if we could elaborate on that a little bit more, the hypervigilance biological roller coaster.
Well, the hypervigilance issue is that elevated alertness. And when they're in that elevated alertness, they're enhancing their safety factors. They're watching, they're observant, they're aware. It's very fatiguing for people to do that. But when they get off duty, this is where we find we have significant withdrawal from social relationships. And it's those social relationships off duty, the activity in a rich personal life where the officer can return to that probability thinking and having trusting relationships. But pretty soon we start seeing this clustering of officers only trusting other officers. We start seeing officers pulling back from social encounters. But we also see the officers in this fatigue state stop exercising. We start seeing impact on sleep. That the two red flags to me that an officer is not doing well are pretty classic red flags. They're incremental weight gain and it's sleep disorder. Now, everybody looks at incremental weight gain in police and they joke about it. They talk about donuts and cops gaining weight because of donuts, but they never really study it. When you put your brain into an elevated level of alertness, what's happening is the cortisol, the adrenal cortical response engages. The cortisol hits the liver. The liver releases huge amounts of blood glucose. That's the fuel, that's the energy the cop is feeling, the dispatcher is feeling when they're actually in a tactical situation. That the blood glucose, they're alert, they're alive, those neurons are firing. But simultaneously, the pancreas is kicking out insulin. The insulin grabs the blood glucose, a significant amount of this blood glucose, and then holds it in reserve. It infuses it in the fat cells, primarily around the abdominal area, for use for the stress that's to come. The best analogy to that I can draw is what bears are doing right now. We're entering into the fall season right now. Bears will be twice as fat at the end of October as they are at the beginning of October, even if the bear has no food. If all food is withheld from the bear will still become twice as fat at the end of this month because of the infusion of glucose from cortisol into the fat cell. That's how they survive. Production of fat in response to stress is the normal response. If humans didn't get fat, they wouldn't have survived through evolution. When the Ice Age came and famines came, skinny people died. The people who had the capacity to produce fat are the people that survived. Unfortunately, with our police officers and our dispatchers, they go into elevated alertness all day long. So they're having this constant cortisol release all day long. They're infusing glucose into the fat cell. Now, our firefighters who go into very dangerous situations and risk their lives to save other people have a different phenomena. A bell goes off, they go into a hypervigilant mode, they clear the call, and they come back. They have episodes of hypervigilance followed by episodes of being at the firehouse. They deal with known risk. A cop deals with unknown risk. A firefighter deals with known risk. There's a difference between the two. Both are serving others greatly. But the cop has this constant secretion of cortisol, which is why they get fat. It's why women buy calendars of firefighters. You know, women don't buy calendars of cops with their shirts off. Nobody wants to see that. You know, what would you call that? You know, badges and bellies. I mean, and we sit back and we watch cops gain this weight as if it's a benign phenomenon. This is where the group out of Reno started identifying early detection for type 2 diabetes and heart disease in police, because the first marker is an increase of the waist size. Yet when I would look at police officers 2-3 years after their academy experience, they had gained 4 or 5 pounds in those couple of years. They would think that's benign, but it was cumulative. So the next year they'd gain 2-3 pounds, and the next year they would gain 2-3 pounds. So what we were finding were officers who were 175 pounds of muscle at the police academy. Now, 10 years later, they've gained 25 pounds. And part of that is the infusion of glucose and the development of insulin resistance, which has the officer having the precursors of life-ending diseases. You know, we've known for many years that heart disease and stroke have been presumptive injuries for police officers. In some states, the officer doesn't even have to show proximate cause. If the officer is invested in the retirement system, if they have a heart attack or they have a stroke, it's a presumptive injury. Well, as Gordon Graham always says, if we can make that prediction, then we can prevent it. And yet we still really don't. So we have officers enhancing, they're getting better and better at being cops. They're getting better and better at functioning at the top of that roller coaster, but the bottom is causing the destruction of their personal life and their health. We see the incremental weight gain. And the second marker is we see a reduction of sleep. We know that sleep, about 49 hours of sleep is required for optimal functioning and decision making. 80, and more than 80, actually 83% of police officers report less than that amount of sleep. 4 to 6 hours of sleep becomes the norm. But when you look at reaction time studies and judgment studies, police officer versus civilians, police officers unfortunately make 600% more reaction time errors and judgment errors because of sleep deprivation. I'm always astounded at how we ignore sleep in terms of mental health with police. Not too long ago, I was doing a seminar at a pre-COVID at a fairly large police department. And the seminar was supposed to start at 8 a.m. I get to the venue, I'm there, I'm set up, and the chief of police comes in and he goes, "Doc, we're going to get started a little bit late this morning. The guys in the class are just getting off duty. They're going to debrief and then walk across to the auditorium." I said, "So your officers are just getting off duty before they come to training?" "Oh, yeah. And, well, how long have they been on duty for, Chief?" And he says, "Well, 12 hours. We work 12. So they went on at 8 p and they're getting off at 8 a. So, sir, your officers will have just had 12 hours on duty, and then they have to listen to my patter for 8 more hours. That's a minimum of 20 hours of sustained wakefulness." And the chief says, "Doctor, don't worry. They'll stay awake." I said, "No, Chief, I do worry because I assume they will stay awake." Not a testimonial to my lecturing ability, but a testimonial to how pervasive sleep disorder is in our police officers. And when we start not looking at this, these are products of teaching officer safety. We have to teach it, but we have to show cops how to manage it, and we have to start early. Our models for services are typically to wait with these clinical services until a problem develops and we try to fix the broken cop. I want to get in front of that and stop breaking cops. So hypervigilance keeps the cop alive, but these early markers, if the cop's waist size is increasing and his sleep is getting shorter, we have a problem. We have to have that officer see that and start addressing that.
Well, thank you, Dr. Gilmartin. You've explained that so well, and I think that concept of the hypervigilance biological roller coaster has helped so many of our heroes nationwide and throughout the world, and it's just, I think it's really key to your message, so appreciate you elaborating on that. Extremely helpful. And another phenomenon that
Thank you for watching this episode of the FBI NAA's Officer Resiliency, Safety, and Wellness video series. Next month, we will be presenting another discussion with Dr. Gilmartin and Dr. Black, featuring single identity.